This story is about Crow's Nest, my birthplace, and how my family settled in North Sydney at the beginning of the 20th century. My father's family moved to North Sydney from Braidwood in the early 1900s, initially living in Ridge Street. The house still stands today. Later the family moved to Myrtle Street, where Dad was born in 1913. My grandfather joined the North Sydney Police Force, and as the family grew they moved to a larger home in Willoughby. Killed on duty on the Pacific Highway, then known as Lane Cove Road, Grandfather left behind 6 children. Plenty of land for growing fruit and vegetables. My grandmother, the local midwife in Willoughby, found a strong community spirit, despite little money. I loved visiting my grandmother's home. The backyard seemed like a small farm. Nan was born in Parramatta. Her parents had settled in Australia from France and Bohemia. My mother's father was born in Scotland, survived the Boer War and travelled to the United States, where he built up his health and fitness. He took up boxing. While on tour in Australia from Canada, he met my grandmother. They married in 1910 at the Star of the Sea Church in Milsons Point, now the site of St Aloysius College. Grandma's parents, born in Parkes, had hotels and properties around Sydney, and later the Dines Hotel in Milsons Point, one of Henry Lawson's haunts. My grandfather often helped Henry clean up after police brutality and encouraged Henry to return to the bush. In 1914, like many others, my grandfather went to Gallipoli. Surviving the trenches, he was sent to the Somme, only to be captured and imprisoned. He would tell me stories about living on eggshells. After the war, my grandfather purchased land in Crow's Nest and built a home where Mum and her sisters lived. Between hospital bouts, he instigated the Anzac Club above Moorheads in Willoughby Road.
When I was a little girl, I remember helping my father take the chairs to the Anzac Club on Willoughby Road.
Mum and Dad enjoyed dances and balls and visited each other's homes. They played music with friends. Dad worked at Hallstrom's and studied at night. Mum worked in sales for David Jones in the city. Then we had war. Mum joined the Red Cross as a volunteer, raising money to aid the soldiers. In 1942, my parents married. The reception held in the building which is now the North Sydney Council Chambers. They rented a flat in Lavender Bay until 1944. Many people left the harbour foreshores at this time, fearing a Japanese invasion. Dad worked in the protected industries at Clyde Engineering. Around this time, I was born. Moving from Blues Point Road to Atchison Street, Crow's Nest, to live close by my grandparents.
Crow's Nest in the 50s. Crow's Nest in...
Like many of the local children, my sister and myself were born in the Mater Hospital. We considered Mrs. Evans, our neighbour, part of our family. Every Sunday she went to the Baptist church in Crow's Nest. I put drops in her eyes.
My name is Ella Priory, and I've lived here for 66 years, and I'm 94. How's that?
Our friend, known as Darky, a homeless Aboriginal man, always had a place to stay at my grandparents' home. Mum told us Darky deserved a medal for bravery. He never spoke of the war. One day he disappeared, his body discovered in Bradfield Park. My grandfather insisted Darky have a proper military funeral.
This is one of the few houses in Atchison Street that this just hasn't changed. This looks exactly the same as it did in the 50s. And in this house lived a family that had come from Maitland, of Scottish descent. Next door was Uncle Will, and he was just a wonderful person, and he was Welsh, and he used to tell us lots of stories.
When my sister reached school age, Mum worked at Luna Park in the evenings. Initially, neighbours criticised her. Mr. Jones, our neighbour, would take us to the Olympic pool. Later, Mum went to work, known as business, in the city. Grandma took care of us during the school holidays while Mum worked. In spite of Grandpa's injuries, he showed us how to cartwheel, often engaging us in stories of his travels. I remember him writing letters using carbon paper and listening to the midday world news on the ABC, a daily ritual for him. Dad bought Australian-made products only, as he considered them better quality. Whilst renovating the house, he eventually replaced the leaking roof with tiles. His brother helped with the plumbing on weekends. At 7 years old, I remember my dad leaving to work on the Snowy River scheme. Little did he realise that asbestos used would ultimately kill him. He wrote often, with the post delivered twice a day and on Saturdays, sending photos of snow and the people he met. Boys on bicycles delivered telegrams, dressed in khaki shirts and slouch hats.
I was employed as a PMG telegram boy. PMG in those days was stood for the Postmaster General's Department. Some people used to make up names for the PMG, and it was Parramatta Monkey Gang or the Pigs Meat and Gravy and a lot of those sort of things. But my job was to deliver telegrams in the areas that Crows Nest Post Office covered, which is Naremburn, Greenwich, Wollstonecraft, and of course Crows Nest.
People sent telegrams for many occasions. Neighbours became apprehensive when a telegram boy arrived, as sometimes it would herald an illness or death in the family. The mail was delivered twice daily and on Saturday mornings.
In 1958, there was trams were running down Pacific Highway, Falcon Street and Willoughby Road, which, with all the tram tracks around on those streets, was a real cycle hazard for us telegram boys, especially if you got your front wheel caught in it, as I did on the first day that I came to work. And I got my front wheel of my own bike caught in the tram tracks and was buckled severely. And the first conversation I had with the postmaster, it was Jack Benno, was his name, was that he asked me the question, could I ride a bike? And which is, I couldn't blame him, because the first day I worked to ride a bike, and here I'd bring my own bike in, all pranged up.
If we needed to make a call, we'd use the public telephone booth on Devonshire Street, which smelled of Bakelite. To call family in the country, we'd make trunk calls and rare overseas calls at the crowded post office.
This building here behind me is where the Crows Nest Post Office used to be. Over here to my right was the alleyway where the public telephones were, and that went right through to the lane at the back. Along that alleyway, the covered part of it, there was the phone booths. And the doors of the phone booth would open out. So as you're walking towards Pacific Highway, if anybody came out of the phone booth in a real hurry, you'd walk straight into it.
This is my grandparents' house in Devonshire Street, Crows Nest. We lived behind them in Atchison Street. We had a little hole in the fence where we'd go backwards and forwards. My grandfather was fastidious about the garden. He kept a privet hedge all around here, perfectly manicured, and little rock gardens in the middle where we used to play fairies. There was honeysuckle vine.
This site where I am at the moment is where my grandmother used to live with my parents and myself in the 50s. The place has been pulled down now, but when I lived here, there are about 20 houses on this block, on this particular site. Some of them were semis, some of them were little freestanding cottages, and they all butted on to a back lane behind me.
Clothes props! Clothes props! Clothes props!
I often wished I could buy a clothes prop from the tall, skinny clothes prop man who walked the lanes. The Rabbitoh skinned rabbits at the back of his utility. Mum soaked the rabbits in milk to soften the meat. My uncle would kill one of my grandma's chickens for special occasions, and one year he killed my favourite chicken. The Milko filled billy cans each day around dawn, a skinny horse named Bess waiting patiently in the middle of the road. One Christmas the Milko forgot to turn the tap off and milk ran down the road. Then milk bottles arrived. Perhaps Sean Connery of 007 fame acquired his acrobatic skills as he worked around Crow's Nest while visiting his aunt in Emmett Street, North Sydney. During winter, the man from Hague's, wearing a blackened beret and leather apron, delivered coal in his Bedford. Later, Dad bought a fireside kerosene heater. In summer, kids ran along the side of the Iceman's truck. He had a loud laugh and big teeth. He'd break chunks of ice for kids to suck. I missed the Iceman when Mum bought the Kelvinator, the first fridge on the street. The bottle-o drove round the streets collecting bottles. I took my bottles to the shop and with deposit money bought comics. The Shelley's soft drink man would refill our soda siphons and sell soft drinks, first by horse and cart, then by truck. He came around more often at Christmas time. Mr. Morphew reminded me of a giant fuzzy teddy bear. Older kids used to hang around his shop with their bikes. As Gartrell White baker's carts had stopped running, Mr. Morphew became known as the bread man. I still remember the aroma of warm bread when I shopped for my grandmother during the school holidays. Broken biscuits, a real treat for 1 penny. My friend Beverly always seemed to get the ends of Devon or brawn from Mr. Young, the shopkeeper. Youngies, as Dad called him, became the informal social worker, giving advice or information to all. He often gave leftovers to families in need. One woman frequently had bruising, and her husband would shout and disappear for weeks. When I asked what happened, my grandmother explained the war had changed him. I imagined God looked like Mr. Young because of his hair. It was rare to see white-haired men, as many men had died in the war. When self-service stores appeared, we only bought convenience food or ice blocks at Youngie's. Later, he closed down. Local stores weighed produce and placed it in cardboard boxes or brown paper bags, which we saved for school lunches. Sometimes we used string bags to carry goods, as plastic wrappings were not available. We had little waste, feeding food scraps to our bantams or the compost. Grandfather would also burn rubbish in the incinerator. Glass jars kept for jam and sold at school fetes, newspapers tied with string for collection, and cans kept for odds and ends. Grandfather's workshop had rows of cans containing various sized nails and screws.
When the shopping was Friday night, the late shopping, Chatswood crowd would come down to Crow's Nest.
Two of the original businesses that were here in those days are still here, of course not run by the same people, but Kramer Brothers Real Estate was very prominent in the area and had a lot to do with a lot of the home units going up in Wollstonecraft, and also Chopsticks Restaurant that was originally there back in the 40s and 50s is still running, but not by the same people again.
Pat the butcher round the corner always had a joke. Would disappear into the huge wooden fridge and return with the best rump steak in Crow's Nest. Butchers' stores in Crow's Nest with names such as Holloway's, Lane's, Leach's, and Grubbs. The barber, Mr. Holland, chatted outside his store. Across the road, Mr. Penny the pharmacist would smile through his Charlie Chaplin moustache. I enjoyed looking in at his maze.
The Baptist church is in the corner, which has been there forever, and next to it is the new church hall, but it used to be an old wooden building and there was more greenery and grass around. And the next street was the photographic studio and a dress shop and a herbalist shop and a health food shop, and across the road was Penfolds with its 1928 sign, which is where it had been there. And we just had the back paling fences onto the lane, which was rather typical in those days. And the kids used to play in the back gardens and then out in the streets.
Number 45 used to be the homemade chocolate shop. Used to be my shop. Next door, it was the old Fred Hartley, a barber shop. People used to queue up Saturday morning to have a haircut. door after that, a continental cake shop. It was a brilliant cake shop. That means a good homemade chocolate shop, a good cake shop, and a good barber shop.
Our family attended the wedding of Maria, the greengrocer's daughter. They delivered our fruit and veggies. Her father hired the Sydney Town Hall for the wedding reception. We refer to them as the New Australians.
We had 11 butcher shops in Crow's Nest in the 50s and early 60s, and we had about 8 or 10 fruit shops. Some of the people that ran those fruit shops in those days were people like the Mangravides, the Arenas, the Loprestis, the Pupos, and of course my dad, Tony Melly. We got to know a lot of the growers. There were a lot of Chinese and Italian and Lebanese growers around the Ryde Epping area and as far as Castle Hill. It sounded like a long way to go in those days, but as you know, today it's only like 5 minutes down the road, and we used to go out and buy all our local vegetables.
Across the street, at the moment is a restaurant called Sentosa. It used to be fish and chip shop run by Convaglianos. Fridays, people that used to queue up for fresh fish and chips. Run Convaglianos, was a good man. Next door used to be a chemist, but it was an old, dark and dusty little chemist shop those days.
Over the road where the Sea Chest restaurant is, stood a place called Moorheads. It was another haberdashery type of shop where you could get anything for women and girls, underwear, clothes, bits and pieces. But one of the most fascinating things that struck me about this place when I was a kid was they had a wonderful flying fox pulley system that delivered money around the store. It was when people paid their bills, they paid it to the sales assistant, who managed to put all the notes in the change into a little can, which was attached to this pulley. And she'd pull a little handle, and this little can would go rocketing up to another area in the store where Mrs. Moorhead sat with a number of assistants. And they would undo the little can, write out the docket, put the change back in, they'd pull another little pulley, and off the little can would go back to the sales assistant, where she would unpack it and give the change and the docket back to the customer. And I thought that was so cute.
Under the maze of overhead tram cables, Mr. Williams directed traffic with his white gloves. He often asked how the family was doing. I wondered if his father was the owner of O.J. Williams, the department store.
I remember so well was the O.J. Williams building.
Yeah.
And that was the closest thing to a town sort of shop that I think you could get. It was sort of like going to town when you weren't going to town.
Yes, that's right.
And I can remember my mother loved going there because it had haberdashery and shoes and
wool, lots of wool.
Lots of wool and materials.
Lovely fabrics. I remember the fabrics.
Yeah. And then of course there was the arcade. Now that hasn't changed much, has it?
Still boring.
Still boring. I mean, remember there was that funny little ticket box where that an
the
old
lotteries.
man, or yes, they used to sell lottery tickets and cigarettes.
Paying bills at the gas company on the Pacific Highway became a treat during summer when walking on the cold marble floors. With tall columns and stairs, I would imagine being in a famous temple in Egypt, like the ones my grandfather told me about. Moran and Cato's sold various types of sausages, all shapes and sizes, which hung high above the counter. The delicious smell pervaded the store. The glass counters displayed many types of cheeses, while bottled vegetables and tins with colourful labels from overseas lined the walls.
So I remember Grandma used to love going in there. There was a lovely tall young man called George that she was quite fond of. I think he used to give her the best cuts of meat or something. And but I can remember, I think that was the first supermarket, and Grandma and a lot of other people got a little concerned that it was going to up the prices and the quality wouldn't be nearly as good. And I'm sure that was the first supermarket.
And it was marvellous. You could go to the grocers, leave your grocery order, they'd make it all up and deliver it to you. Different from having to get in your cars these days. The shop was called Steggles Hardware. It was very fascinating to go into because he had everything with the kitchen sink in it. nuts and bolts and bits and pieces and stacked all the way up, and you could buy almost anything there. It was just quite fantastic.
Meat pie shop. The best meat pies in Willoughby Road or no, in Crow's Nest. People used to come from all over, from Sydney, especially for meat pie. I remember that much very well.
Coles and Woolworths, opposite each other in Willoughby Road, never sold food. Sales assistants, usually dressed in black, stood behind long counters while we admired the merchandise.
The other thing we used to come to Crow's Nest for was to buy dairy snow at Coles. The big Coles that used to be run from Pacific Highway into Willoughby Road. It was sort of a soft ice cream, and we thought it was really delicious. The only other place you could get soft ice cream on the North Shore, I think, was at Manly, and they had Dairy Queens, and you had to queue up for about half an hour to get one.
So after, it used to be a frog shop, and then after that, the wine bar. The old diggers, they used to go, they have a glass of wine or a drink. Sometimes there was a little problem.
Joe Jockey Peterson had a health and fitness centre above the shops in Willoughby Road. If you go up towards the hotel at Crow's Nest Junction, on the left-hand side there, you'll see several doorways, and the entrance to Joe's Health and Fitness Centre was up the stairs and through one of those doorways. I think it was next door to what was the Peter's Milk Bar, which was a popular meeting place in Crow's Nest in those days.
The Salvation Army Band played on the corner of Burlington Street and Willoughby Road. Women with their tightly bonneted heads shook ribbon tambourines wildly. Men's cheeks puffed while blowing brass instruments, the drum beats attracting children from all around. Marion, the very dyed blonde hairdresser, resembled Marilyn Monroe, laughed a lot and tap danced in her spare time. Often you see women with their hair in rollers covered with scarves while they shopped, especially on Saturday mornings.
For counter lunch, we'd buy a baked rabbit.
Did you?
3 of us could split it up and eat it on the counter. My parents probably didn't know that I was in the hotel.
After work on weekdays, men spilled out onto the footpath at the Crow's Nest Hotel, talking, laughing and drinking beer. Some hotels had ladies-only lounges, as women were not permitted in the bars. On Saturday afternoons you could hear the races. I avoided walking past the hotel.
The hotels or the pub, they used to close 6 o'clock. One of the boys, they used to have an argument in the pub. They say, all right, boys, down the line, off we go, let's have a bet. They used to bet who's going to win.
Oh.
And off they used to fight here. And at the same time, the girls, they used to play two-up here. How can you describe the girls?
Besides memories, I discovered in George's garage a tangible reminder.
There was gangs around the area. There was a gang at Crow's Nest, which was called the Crowie Boys, and there was also another gang, a rival gang, at Neutral Bay, and they were known as the Bay Boys. And there's a couple of times I was at night time. I used to be in the Scouts, Second Lavender Bay Scouts. We used to meet in a room under the grandstand at North Sydney Oval. And coming home one night, I remember some of the Crowie Boys bailed me up, and it was only because I knew one of them from the post office that I got out of it unscathed. But if they didn't know me, they would have had great sport with me, and so they did with quite a few other people. The Bay Boys used to come up, and they'd send a couple of fellas up and go into a milk bar, which is nearly on the corner of Falcon and Alexander Street. There was a hamburger shop and right on the corner, and there was a milk bar next door to it, and that was where the Crowie Boys hung out. And the Bay Boys, if they wanted to have some sort of a rumble, they'd send a couple of blokes up and throw something into the shop or go in and then they'd pick a time and a date and they'd all meet and they'd all have a bit of a blow.
Men dressed up. In the early 50s, there were many dances and balls. Dad used to scrape the blade of the cutthroat razor on the leather strop hanging on the back of the bathroom door. Most women wore gloves and carried handbags when visiting the city. Considered a social occasion, there was lunch at Carl's and tea at Repham's. Mum bought our school shoes at Farmer's or David Jones. I would place my feet in the X-ray box while looking through the eyepiece as my toes and wriggling bones moved on the bright green screen. On Saturdays, we went to Hoyt's Picture House with my cousin Joni. I remember seeing Hopalong Cassidy, Roy Rogers and Spider-Man. Often serials appeared more exciting than the main feature. Cartoons ran before the main films.
And we used to come up here to Crow's Nest on a Saturday afternoon and go to Hoyt's Theatre right here. I don't remember too much about the movies, but I do remember buying Jaffas and sitting in the front row of the circle, and we used to put the Jaffas along the balustrade and flick them at all the boys who sat in the stalls. I think, I'm not quite sure, but maybe only on Saturday afternoons they used to segregate the audience, and the boys used to sit downstairs and the girls used to sit upstairs.
They used to have contests on the stage on Saturday matinees, pillow fights on a greasy pole sort of thing, and trying to eat apples from a string. And of course that attracted a lot of the children to the special matinees.
Oh yeah, Auntie Phil worked at the Hoyt's Theatre. That was where Woolworths are today. That was a Hoyt's Theatre, and she worked in the chocolate bar. And my son used to think that she owned that, but because she used to get in the pictures for nothing, she'd ask the manager, say, "It's all right, let the boys in," and he'd say, "In you go." So they used to think that she owned the hotel, owned the picture show.
The manager there was, during the 50s, was Ray Kellaway. Perhaps I shouldn't mention his name. He later became manager of the French's Forest Drive-In, and he was a fairly strict disciplinarian, and but he used to look after the children. He used to shepherd the children across the road after the matinee, shepherd them through the traffic.
The highlight of the week when we all decided to go to the movies, the local movie theatre, which was sometimes a queue 50 to 60 metres long, and it was like a bob, I think, to get in those days. And of course it was the hangout of all the local gangs, and everyone would stare each other off to see who was the toughest, you know, and everyone had the tight jeans, the leather jackets and the buckle belts and fancy shoes. But it was the highlight to the week, and actually it got to the stage where if we wanted to see the movies more than once, we'd actually go next door to the little guy who had the shop next door and sold all the drinks, a guy called Mr. Ross in those days. And myself and Alan Gilmore would jump the fence and steal all these empty bottles. So then we'd go back in and sell them to him to try and make a bob, because we got a penny each for them. And that allowed us to get back into the movies again.
My favourite picture house, the Sesqui on the Pacific Highway, played the tune Limelight as I sat upstairs in the plush velour seats watching extravagant MGM musicals. Sometimes I would look at the sculptures on the walls, especially the Anzacs. This created a horror for me.
I know a lot of people still remember the theatre, but we had what was originally the Sesqui down the bottom of Crow's Nest, which then became the Metro, and last of all, before they pulled it down, was the Dendy.
I always dreamed of having bubble baths, like in Esther Williams movies. When we had our baths, we heated water in a copper and carried it in a bucket to the bath. But once I used rinso to make bubbles.
And Sunday afternoons were really pretty dull in the 50s. There wasn't much to do after having the baked dinner, except just sit around. And occasionally I'd be allowed out to play, and we'd often play out on the road, have a game of rounders or something. My mother was not too keen on me playing on the road. I think she thought I was going to get knocked down by a car. But there was little chance of that because there were so few cars around here. Nobody owned one way back then. And probably the only thing that might have been a danger was the fact of a horse and cart knocking us down. Over in the St Leonard Centre over there, well, that was the site of the old stables at Crow's Nest, where they used to have horses and carts being stabled. They used to deliver milk and bread from there.
I rode a Cyclops scooter on the street, where many kids played as there were few cars. We had a cubby house in our yard, with running water too. We made up games, mainly of kings and queens and knights, and played hospitals. We never went to libraries, but I read books my aunt gave me. Aunt Mary told stories of exotic places and had a radiogram in which she played her favourite records. I loved the radio serials and stories. White Coolies, a program about nurses captured by the Japanese, left a lasting impression on me. Oh, it scared me of being kidnapped by Japanese in submarines.
Robin had a phonograph and she used to have it out on the front footpath, and she used to charge the kids so much and give them a bag of lollies and send the money to the Far West Children's Home.
In this laneway is where I grew up with a real mixture of people. We were nearly all, well, we were locals then, and most of our parents were in business here, and fortunately for our sake, we backed onto these back lanes where we all played rugby and cricket, tennis, and did all those things that kids do. It was actually a gravel road in those days, and at times when we did play rugby, it actually started off as touch rugby and ended up full tackling rugby. As you can imagine, it must have hurt. But I'd say there was probably about 6 or 7 different nationalities living in the street, from Chinese to Croatians to Italians and Greeks and what have you. And I think at the time there was only one Aussie living in this back lane.
When television began in 1957, our neighbour across the road bought a television. All the kids in the street would watch the Mickey Mouse Club. Kids knew every song and name of the Mouseketeers. Plastic Mickey Mouse ears were all the rage. Gradually, television sets took over, until we too had a set. The weekend nights of pianola singing sessions with Dad and family card games stopped. Traditional owners of Tunks Park, known as the Gully, had long since gone. Ironically, we played cowboys and Indians, roaming for hours into the bush.
Going down to the bush, which Wollstonecraft in those days had plenty of, and we'd spend our days down there and occasionally come home with a tick in our body somewhere, which some of us experienced, or a big lump on the head where we got hit by someone throwing a rock.
50s, you had children by the dozen. There were plenty of children in the area, 2 schools, they were fully occupied with the children. Now, there are no children, I don't see any children at all for dentistry, and both the schools in the area have closed down.
There was a time when I was going to school where it was pretty difficult because of racial prejudice. I think was both ways, not just one way. But it was interesting that going to school in those days, Mum would make me a nice big fat lunch and I was too scared to open it. But then as time moved on, it got to the stage where Mum couldn't make me enough because all my mates were eating it.
Milk sat in crates in the schoolyard, souring in summer sun, while marching into classrooms to music or an eager drummer. At lunch I looked forward to the sergeant's meat pies on Mondays. It beat soggy sandwiches. If I was really good, I could have a cream bun.
Friday was the worst time at school because Mum would put things on my sandwiches and the nuns would go around inspecting our sandwiches because we weren't allowed to eat meat on Friday, and obviously if you had meat on your sandwich they'd take it out of your sandwich and throw it away. So you were just left with your salad or whatever else was left.
Angelus every day, benediction on Fridays, and Sunday Mass, religion influenced all of us at St Leonard's in Naremburn. Sister Patricia instilling a sense of social justice, leaving us petrified of committing a mortal sin or going to hell. I love to sing in choir, using the mysterious language of Latin. Divorce was banned, therefore never mentioned. We collected pennies for the missions and were warned about the communists invading Australia. Dad told Mum he was voting for a good man, a communist. I was worried my school friends would find out. After the strict Father Rowan's death, Father Holland was assigned as parish priest. He had a sense of humour and was very popular, very proud of his parishioners' contributions to the church spire.
Coming back from church on a Sunday morning, we take the shortcut up the back lane, and all these wonderful aromas of baked dinners would be sort of drifting on the air. And everybody had baked dinners then, all cooked in fat or lard, of course, and it was just the most wonderful smell. And then we'd come back and have our own baked dinner.
Tramway on Willoughby Road provided a safer home after school, avoiding confrontations. On Daly's Road, opposite the church, rambling gardens surrounded a mansion called Banbar. While this mansion, Wheatley, was used as a private hospital and later as a hotel, now replaced with blocks of units. Trams seared Willoughby Road and the Pacific Highway and down Falcon Street. In earlier times, green flags in front yards alerted tram drivers to resist hitting the gong in respect of illness.
We used to come up here on the trams from Milson's Point Station. The trams used to go through Milson's Point Station. And those days, I remember I fell off one day and got concussion, hit my head on the platform.
Going into town, the city, looking over the side of a tram, I saw sharks and curious creatures thrashing about under the green water. Poor elephant patiently walked around in circles, with the zoo's strange mixture of smells made it such a special occasion. Despite not having a car, we would pack a picnic lunch and off we go to Balmoral Beach on Sundays. Towards the end of the tram ride, I would imagine I was on safari. I loved the tingling cold water and the salty taste and the trails of salt left to dry on my skin. Grabbing cotties and towels and off to the beach with my best friend Beverly and her family, who had a truck. Jumping in the back after hurriedly getting permission from Mum and Dad. At Christmas, we saw pantomimes. My favourite store was Mark Foy's because of the chandeliers and the creaky timber floorboards.
On the corner of Hume Street and Pacific Highway. But back in the 50s, it was a huge vacant block where the circus came to town every December. It was a source of great fun for us kids who could go and see the acrobats and the elephants and the lions. But the grown-ups around the place hated it because the poor circus people didn't have any toilet amenities. And so they came around and knocked on the back doors and the front doors of houses, desperate to use the toilets. And most people really hated that intrusion. But one person who did enjoy the circus coming to town was probably John Hay, whose hay and grain store is here now, at least the remains of it, and because he would have done a roaring trade with the animals that were there at the circus.
At Easter time, the great excitement was the show. The smell of the farm animals, seeing baby chicks, the parade, the simple bags, tiny jars and samples of food, all the little packets which came in handy for our games of shops. No cheap toys. Darrell Lee made the only Easter eggs.
So it would have been 1956. In September, Pauline had her birthday party in the hotel, and all the girls from Loretto were invited up, And I remember we were having a wonderful party, and then all of a sudden the mother said it is time to say the rosary before tea, so we all had to kneel down in what was the public bar. It was Sunday night, actually, the bar wasn't open. And all these little girls are kneeling there saying the rosary. I think it was the Sorrowful or Joyful Mysteries. And then after that, the father unveiled the new thing that they had at Crow's Nest Hotel, which was a jukebox. And that was the first time I ever heard Rock Around the Clock. And I could always remember that. It was just such a terrific tune. Pauline had an older sister, Mary, and she'd been to a mixed party, and there were boys there, wow. And she showed us a game that they'd played at this mixed party, which was passing an orange around the circle under your chin. Now, that was very, very, actually it would be rather, I don't think I'd like to play it now. I don't think
As a Girl Guide, I felt proud when my troop won the Cup for North Sydney. We used to meet at the back of the Manresa Hall in Carlo Street and camped in the bush at Thornley. School kids waited all morning in the hot sun on the Pacific Highway to wave flags and see the Queen. Some of my school friends fainted. We hardly saw her.
I remember walking up to the attic, and I sat there and waited. We could see the harbour, and I could only see a small section of the harbour, but we could see the ship that she was on came in the heads and into the harbour. We could see it, and that was a big thing to say, oh, the Queen's on that ship, and you couldn't see the Queen.
Another event, the papal visit. Yet another hot day with kids fainting around me.
I still get old patients coming here that I did dental work for in 1949. Kids have always been scared of going to the dentist, it's born with them. But anyhow, well, you just had to manage them somehow or other, take them along slowly, and most children ended up all right, although some didn't. You had to get a general anaesthetic to do the fillings with. When I graduated there, hardly anyone got a local injection for a filling. In the olden days, no one come to the dentist unless they lost a meal in the cavities of their teeth. They had pain, and the holes were very, very deep, you see.
I began high school at Monte St Angelo College to follow the tradition of mother and aunts. Our family moved to a larger home in Middle Cove. I rarely visited Crow's Nest, except to see my grandmother. Grandfather died in the early 60s, and in the 70s my grandmother died. Mum worked at the Helping Hand Mission in Holterman Street with the present councillor Shirley Collis and Roger Bush. In the 90s, I returned from overseas and noticed big changes in Crow's Nest. Property values had increased, new stores, many more restaurants and cafes. Despite having little money, kids created games, made their own entertainment while parents worked very hard. I still remember the intrigue and excitement of making new discoveries. Whatever the accents, friends, food, or personalities, I developed a curiosity to explore the world and travel. The 50s planted seeds of social change. As the year 2001 comes to a close, I look to my mother, who now lives in a retirement village in Chatswood. My sister lives in Waverton, and I live in Woolstercraft with my son, not too far from where I was born. Does this 100-year-old tree hold the memory of my father playing nearby with his brother and sisters? I smiled to myself walking along Myrtle Street. As domestic cleaners in a van search for a parking space, I wonder what my grandmother would have said in this little street, and how it will look in the next 100 years, and how important it is to preserve our changing social history and protect our heritage for future generations.
On my way home, waved to the butler with his horse and cart. Mama, did you go to Pat the butcher and the baker? Then we catch the tram to buy our fish and chips. Crow's Nest in the 50s. Crow's Nest in the 50s. Take my cousins down to Bali for a swim. Fill the salt on my skin in the oval. At the pictures see Hopalong Cassidy. Come home and play rounders in the street. Holidays under the apricot tree with our jets and fresh orange juice. Playing Monopoly. Hot summer days and the ice cream man. On Sunday night, Salvation Army band. Crow's Nest in the 50s. Crow's Nest in the 50s. That was Crow's Nest in the 50s.